Welcome back. While Apphia does not have the misfortune of being one of the many unnamed women in Scripture, by the way, the naming of the unnamed that I mentioned offhandedly a week or two ago, I'm giving that serious consideration. So, interested? Like maybe when this series is done, we'll do that? Anyway, Apphia is named. That's kind of all we know about her. There has been wondering if perhaps she's married to Philemon or is, in some other way attached to one of the two men named in this greeting from Paul. So there are three people. One of them is Apphia, and it's rare for Paul to greet a woman in the greeting of the letter. Not rare for Paul to acknowledge and honor the work that women are doing. Just a little more rare that it would be where it is in the letter. But that's kind of all we have to go on. Translation from the original language makes some of this difficult, of course, because let's be real, throughout the years, all of that gets messed with, right? I choose to think because Paul greets her that Apphia is one of those women leaders of the early church. And Paul has worked with her or has heard of what she was doing. That's really all we know. And so what her story does is remind us that there is a purpose to her name being included beyond simply that it happened to be in the letter of Philemon and we decided to put Philemon in the Bible, so she's there. There's more to it. So stick with me. We're going to circle back after we've spent a little time with Abigail. In the meantime, Apphia, I hope that in your life you were seen and that you and your calling were recognized for what they were because of you. Not because of the people to whom you were attached, but because of who you are and how you were called, all on your own. And if you weren't in your time, I hope you know that you are now. So let's turn back the clock a bit to Abigail. In the NRSV, New Revised Standard Edition, not the NRSV UE, which, if I'm being honest, I've not delved into, she is described as, in this order, clever and beautiful. And her husband, Nabal, by contrast, is described as surly, and mean. Physical beauty is routinely used, especially in the Old Testament, to describe women. Interestingly, it is also used often throughout the Old Testament to describe significant men. If you're unaware of that or choose to not believe that, I encourage you to look up people like Samson and David and Solomon. There are others. Those are the first three that came to mind when I was writing. So look them up. I don't love that physical beauty is used in ways to bring validation, which is often what it is used in ways to bring validation to who people are in relation to the community. And that's typically what's being done here. But that's what it is. I think an argument can be made, though, that it's not only that in this instance in particular, there are others, but in this instance in particular, I think at least One purpose in using beautiful as a descriptor of Abigail was to highlight even more difference between Abigail and Nabal. The writer doubles down on Nabal's description, surly and mean. Like, he's really, really mean. If we're going to say surly, look it up. Ill, bad-tempered, and mean. Combine those two to find the depth of Nabal's character and what it probably was like to live with him. I'm guessing not great. Not to mention all the people who served him and worked alongside of him. He's not just mean. It's in his nature. And I think it's down to his core. But then we have Abigail the clever and Abigail the beautiful. And both traits come into play in this particular story. And I think that's why, and this might just be the author in me, we are given these descriptions because it's a little foreshadowing technique of what is to come. Abigail is informed of the dangerous decision that Nabal has made. One of his men comes to her and says, you got to hear this. We got to do something or we're all going to die. Now, that person may have thought he was being hyperbolic, but he was not. The intent was to kill them. But Abigail, upon hearing this, has an important decision to make. On the one hand, she can approach Nabal and try to get him to change his answer, to do something different. But remember, he's the surly and mean one, so there's a known certainty, a known reaction that she's facing if she does that. On the other hand, she takes the chance of approaching David, who by this point is very well known for, his reactions to things. Uriah, think about what happened to him. His reactions to things, his temperament in certain situations. These are known things, but she's never directly experienced it. So to her, it's a battle of the known terrible, if not evil, and the unknown probably not great, but probably not as bad as the known. It's not an easy choice. Both involve risk. So she makes her choice, right? She says, well, this is rare. Human condition typically forces us to choose the known over the unknown. There's a train if you hear it. But Abigail pushes through that and chooses to go see David. And the way that she goes about it is where the initial descriptor, many verses earlier, of Abigail as clever comes into play. She is wise and therefore knows that before she asks for anything, she must first appease the wrongs, at least from David's perspective, that were done by Nabal. So she lays it on thick. First, she sends ahead of her gifts of food, likely to replace the feast that David and the men were denied. Then she defers to David's understanding of self and prostrates herself, showing him the respect that he did not get from Nabal, and that David most certainly believes he deserves. She never denies Nabal was wrong and goes so far as to take their full responsibility on herself. Finally, most significantly, she talks to David from an angle that even David cannot ignore. What, David, would God want you to do? Abigail's understanding of who God is and how God works, I think, is the turning point for David. It seems pretty clear in the text, right? In the end, David relents and calls off his men from their would-be mass murder, because that's what it would have been. But that is not the end of Abigail's story. Shortly thereafter, after Abigail returns home and after she tells Nabal, not confesses, mind you, because she is confident that she made the right choice, so she is not confessing. After she tells Nabal what she has just returned from, Nabal dies shortly thereafter. And shortly thereafter, David sends messengers requesting Abigail's presence to be his wife. It's not what we would call a romantic proposal. We couldn't even really call it a proposal. It's more of a, I know that you are now a widow, so you don't really have any choice but to come marry me. So she does. This is where I think the beautiful comes in, by the way. David has a lot of wives, and I think that he sees not only her beauty for sure, but I'm choosing to lean into the possibility that David recalled what Abigail had recently done and saw in her traits that he respected. He was able to review how Abigail got him to relent, quieted his anger, changed his plan, and respected that. That's what I'm going to choose to believe. Is that specifically spelled out? No, it's not. But I want to give Abigail credit where credit is most certainly due. And so Abigail agrees and becomes one of David's many wives. In fact, if you've read the text for today, you'll note that the next sentence is another wife that David takes. And a reminder of what has happened to Michal. I think we talked a little bit about that last week. So Apphia lived a life of ministry as a leader in an early house church. Yet we know basically nothing about her beyond her name. She certainly isn't discussed from the pulpit. Now, Philemon itself, the book, it's not long. It's a chapter. But Philemon itself is not often preached from the pulpit, but when it is, how many pastors who preach on it, on Philemon, skip right over Apphia? Like, read the text, because really in a Sunday service you could read the whole book of Philemon because it's that short. But how many say her name in the original greeting and then that's it? That's a disservice to Apphia, because at bare minimum, she deserves to have it explored as to why. How does Paul know her? It's a good question. And Abigail? I wonder how often her story is told in a derogatory manner, or how often everything that we talked about today, the turning of David's mind, the fact that she saved her entire family, and the troops, soldiers, whatever they were, of Nabal, workers, I think actually, she saved them all from certain death. How often instead do we just think of her as David's wife? She saved all those people. She prevented the not quite yet king from adding more sin to his plate. May have been a man after God's own heart, but he had some issues. The NRSV at least lists clever as the first descriptor, so that's something. The point is this: Apphia and Abigail are named women who don't get much recognition for who they are in their own right, rather than as secondary characters in another person's story, which is the more common, if at all they are referenced, that's how it is. Abigail is not simply one of David's wives. She was called to a whole lot more than these events captured in the snippets from 1 Samuel 25. What I'm beginning to see to a new depth is that this isn't God. This is the lens of the writers. This is the downside of free will, right? People write what they write. I believe they were inspired. I do believe that the Spirit intervened. And I believed that God always allowed for their humanity to come through. Why else would we have 4 different, similar, but different, not identical, accounts of Jesus' life, of ministry? 4 different, similar, different accounts from 4 different lenses. Why would we have those? If not to reflect both humanity, free will, and now I'm changing the both to all, and the ability to show that from different perspectives come different passions and purposes, right? Not to mention the volume. If you read the Old Testament straight through, you'll see this. The volume of repetition and angles throughout the Old Testament, right? Same stories, different angle. Same story, different angle. Happens a lot in the Old Testament. If you are unsure about that, try reading it straight through from 1 Samuel through the end of Chronicles, or get yourself a chronological Bible, and it will open your eyes to a lot. So here we are, taking a fresh look through a new lens at the stories of these women. The proof of their calling, I hate that we even have to say that because we shouldn't have to prove it. The proof of their calling, the proof of their value and worth, something else we should never have to say, is evident in their inclusion, no matter how small, in this book we call the Bible. In fact, I'm beginning to wonder if the Spirit fought through the human barriers of these writers to ensure that these pieces of these women's stories were told. And were told in part because of the foreknowledge the Spirit had of the generations of women to come, whose stories would not be seen, whose stories would be erased, whose call and value and worth, independent of men, would not only be put into question, but would be denied. Generations of women who would need to hear the truth of their purpose and of their calling. Because sadly, these women aren't getting it anywhere else, most especially not from the pulpit, which is where it should be. I think you know the end by now, right? We need to share. We need to like, we need to comment, we need to subscribe. Let's get it out there. And why? Why do we need to? Because for too many people, the truth that she is called is just unknown or not believed. But here's the truth. She, whoever she may be, they are called. She is called, and she is speaking. See you next week.